When you start adding extras on top of that, whether you're adding another third-party plugin to bring a different feature, or you're having someone custom code something for you to do some special functionality, that's when you're often introducing extra accessibility issues. And so you'll want to make sure that you're going through and checking the entire kind of user journey, whether that's the customer journey buying something or someone signing up on your website, or going through your LMS system, the courses, going through there, and you're just kind of checking primarily, all of those base things, but then especially keyboard navigation. So it's not uncommon at all to find places in e-commerce sites where the cart and checkout process has keyboard navigation issues or other kinds of issues around screen readers not reading out text.
Welcome to the Web Design Business Podcast with your host, Josh Hall, helping you build a web design business that gives you freedom and a lifestyle you love.
It's been a little while since we've talked about accessibility here on the podcast. We've had some conversations, which I'll make sure we link to in the show notes for this episode, about accessibility. But one thing we have not talked about specifically is accessibility for e-commerce, which, come to find out, and not shockingly, is and can be a very, very complex thing. So that's what we're going to take a deep dive into. And this one, I'm real excited to bring on accessibility expert Bet Hannon, who is the CEO of accessicart.com. And there's a lot of really cool things in this one. This whole conversation, it starts off simple and basic in the world of accessibility, which I'm kind of glad, because we do get into the nitty gritty. But we pretty quickly take a deep dive into accessibility for e-commerce. So you're going to learn a lot about the basics of accessibility and just some quick accessibility wins that you can have on your site and all of your client sites, things that you could do one-off and pretty quickly. You can also do these things ongoing and roll this into a growth plan or a support plan, but a lot of things you could just have as common practice for your websites. We really get into the weeds, though, on e-commerce accessibility traps, what to avoid. The number one culprit for restaurant sites in the way of accessibility. Can you guess what that is? Well, you'll learn that here in this conversation. And we also talk about how to just build your websites from the ground up with accessibility in mind, whether they're simple portfolio sites, quote unquote simple, or whether they are e-commerce sites. Bet is really someone who knows her stuff, and it's very evident from that one on this one. Now, I am not an accessibility expert, which is why I rely on folks like Bet to really stay at the forefront of what's going on here. And I say that to say, if you feel overwhelmed with accessibility, you are not alone, because I'm right there with you. But I think it's so important to constantly be reminded of the basics of accessibility and know what to cover moving forward. And while we do get into some of the lawsuits and penalties that have been circulating around in accessibility, I also do not want you to feel intimidated or scared by this for web design as a whole. It's kind of a disclaimer here, because you could very quickly be like, all right, I'm done. I don't even want to worry about this stuff. So maybe I need to find a new profession. But the reality is those things are rare, but they can happen. But what happens is, what I've found is, typically lawsuits and penalties and stuff like that are the things that make headlines. So just remember, while it is a possibility, it is very rare. It reminds me of like privacy and security. It's rare that these events will happen. But in any case, the goal of accessibility is not as much to prevent lawsuits as much as it is to make websites accessible to everyone. And as a father to a special needs child, this is one thing that I'm always reminded by. As much as accessibility feels overwhelming, the goal is for somebody like my daughter, who has vision impairments and has some things she's working against as a special needs kiddo, to make the internet accessible for her too. So keep that in mind. Anytime you're feeling overwhelmed or scared about this, the goal of accessibility is to make it for everyone. So with that in mind, here's Bet, and let's take a deep dive into accessibility, specifically accessibility in e-commerce sites. Bet, welcome to the show. So excited to chat with you. Before I hit record, we were talking about how I think in web design, this is really common for educators like myself, but also agencies. It's like there's just so many components to websites, especially now with accessibility, with privacy, with optimization and conversion and design and copy and messaging and all these different areas. I do think the cool thing is if you have a focus and an emphasis and you can partner up with people who know their stuff, you can learn a lot and it could be a mean group. So all that to say, accessibility. Not my strong suit. I'm so excited to have you on.
Oh, I'm glad to be with you. I really, as you'll discover, I really love talking about this, helping people learn about it, because there are certain pieces of this where people can really just begin to make big impacts for users with disabilities. And that's really the core issue is just making it easier for people to use your sites, right?
Oh, I was going to ask you, what is like the 101 definition of accessibility? So boom, we got that covered. That's a great foundation because So
accessibility is really a kind of form of user experience optimization that includes people with disabilities. So you want to think about how can you make sure that your site works for people who are blind, people who are low vision, people who are colorblind, people who can't use a mouse, or they're not steady enough with a mouse or their finger to hit small targets, small buttons or clicks. And so all kinds of things like that, reading disabilities, can begin to be quite a list of things that can impact user experience. And, it all starts with beginning to think about not everybody uses a website exactly like you do, right?
I'm so glad you prefaced this and kind of laid the foundation for accessibility, because what I've found with some of my students, and I feel this way sometimes when I watch something about accessibility, is it almost feels so overwhelming to even get started, because you're like, oh my gosh, am I going to have to go through like every page of all my client sites? Are they going to pay me for this? Like all that to say, I think the accessibility movement, while awesome, and I totally understand how important it is, I do think it's overwhelmed a lot of web designers and agency owners to where we're like almost paralyzed in like a to-do list now. So where is like the best place to start? Do you help?
Well,
like if somebody
it paralyzes folks, but it's also like there's some fear about legal liabilities and all that other stuff too. And so that all kind of mixes into some of the overwhelm piece. So great places to start are, and I didn't ask you before, do a lot of your folks work in WordPress, or are they working in other platforms too in your community?
I'm a WordPress guy, so I tend to attract at least 50% of I would say my community, in particular, knowing the data is our WordPress users. But I have a lot of folks using Squarespace and Webflow and some other Bill Show It and some others as well.
Yeah. So some great places the one place to start is to realize that accessibility is not just development and code. It's also design, and it's also content. So there are all those pieces that come together to be making content, to make sites more or less accessible. And so a great place to start is by looking at some of those content related things and some of the design things. So actually the 4 top accessibility issues, just by sheer numbers, would be color contrast, making sure you have a good color contrast between background and fonts, alt text on your images, your heading structures are properly nested. You shouldn't ever skip from an H2 to an H4, right? You should always have an H3 in between. And then link text that's not ambiguous. So if you took care of all, you never want to have just click here, right? The links should stand. People who are blind often have the screen reader just read out all the link text on the page. And so if all they hear is click here, click here, click here, that does nothing for them. If it says click here for the report on blah, 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 that tells them what's going to happen.
Adding a descriptive, what you're clicking into.
Yeah, the text that you make into the hyperlink should always be able to stand on its own without any other context, right? Okay. Somebody who clicks that link should know from just those words that you've made into the link where they're going to go, what's going to happen. And so if you just deal with those 4 issues, that's huge, starting place for accessibility. And so there are some great tools to help people get started that are pretty much free out there on the web. So the wavewebAIM.org, so WAVE, wave.aim, webaim.org, is a tool that you can put the URL in, and you can there's actually a browser extension for it too, and you can start to get things like the color contrast and the heading structure and the I don't think it'll do ambiguous link text, but some other tools may, and then that the semantic pieces there, and you can start to begin to work on those issues. When you start to do that, it's important to know that it's going to flag some things as false positives. So for instance, it's an automated tool, right, to check. And automated tools can only find about 30% of issues. So when you start to do that, when it's automated like that, sometimes if you have an image background with font on top of it, that tool can't see the image. So it'll tell you, oh, you have white font on white background, or black font on black background, or it'll sort of say, but that's a not a real issue. That's a false positive. So you got to sort of sort out those issues. But that's a great place to start. If you're in WordPress, there is a free plugin in the WordPress plugin directory called Accessibility Checker. It's from Equalize Digital. And you put it in there, and the free level, you just have to open every post or page editor, and it'll kind of like the Yoast SEO tools, or all the SEO tools at the bottom of the page, right? It shows you the problems that are there and what might need to be there. The paid version of that does some really cool things. If you have a really big site, that could be helpful. But again, all these automated tools are only able to deal with about 30% of issues. So I would say start there, though. That's a great place to start.
Great foundation. Yeah.
Yeah. And then at a certain point, then you want to start learning about checking keyboard navigation. So people who are blind or low vision often navigate through websites using their keyboard. So if you've ever done like Control S or Control V or Control X, right, that's keyboard. You're navigating with the keyboard. And so you're controlling the computer with that keyboard. And there are thousands and thousands of those different little shortcuts. People who are blind or low vision, but also people who have mobility impairments and they can't use a mouse, will use pretty much the tab and the enter key and maybe the space bar or the arrow keys to get through your entire website, if it's accessible. Right. And so beginning to test that, you can start to test that. It doesn't take super special skills. You just start pressing the tab key and see where you're going. And right, can you get through the menu? Can you, do you have what's called skip links at the top? You should have like something that appears in the upper left corner that says skip to the content. So you don't have to go through the menu again after you've been through it once. That's all of those kinds of, start to deal with that keyboard. But at a certain point, you're going to want to bring in other professionals, especially if you have an e-commerce site. So e-commerce is about 80% of the lawsuits in the U.S. For ADA for websites, a little more than 80%. There are special requirements in other places in the world with e-commerce accessibility. And so you'll want to bring in someone else to kind of begin to help you sort through those problems.
And I'm so glad you mentioned the e-commerce side of things. I did want to make sure we hit on some of that because that I don't know nearly anything about that. So and if anyone sees me looking off and typing, I'm making sure we have all these resources ready. And I had to do a little tab on my site too. I think I'm like partway covered, but I have some work to do. I did want to touch on real quick before we dive into accessibility with e-commerce. A couple of things I think are going to be important that lead into that. Yeah. One is you had talked about Hans from Termageddon, who's a good friend of mine, been on the podcast a lot. And I always viewed privacy and accessibility and them being not at war with each other, but conflicting, especially when it comes to having cookie consents and privacy things with pop-ups and that some of those things we know can affect load times and speed and accessibility. Yeah. I guess, what is the difference between the two? I mean, you mentioned, I think before we hit record, they're kind of all under the compliance end of website. Can you just kind of share your insight on accessibility and privacy and how they can work well together?
Well, they're kind of hand in hand. They're kind of hand in hand. And so you want to, they're different things. I mean, they're not at war for sure. And you want to make sure that, the Termageddon privacy policy piece, if you get those cookie generators in there, I know Hans and Donata have really worked hard at trying to make sure that those are all accessible. But if you're not using that, you'll want to make sure that you can test for keyboard navigation and that the that the site goes down into that privacy policy, right? So that a blind user would be able to know that policy is there. They're supposed to click it. Just because they're if it's broken, they'll just keep tabbing, but they won't be able to get anywhere, right? So you want to make sure that it's not broken for those users. But they're not antithetical at all, and it's really about protecting individuals, right? Privacy is about not letting our data be sold, and accessibility is really just about sort of helping all kinds of people, all kinds of users be able to use your site.
And what would be a good resource to test, particularly the tabbing kind of thing? I don't personally know of the best option as far as
at this point, that is a manual test. And so that's a real important thing to note, is that, these automated tools, there are certain things that they're really great at finding for you, the color contrast checkers and all of that. You definitely use those automated tools for what you can get out of them. But just know that, things like keyboard navigation, can you navigate through your site? Are there any problems with that? That all has to be manual. That has to be manually done. And so at least at this point, maybe at some point in the future, but people I know talk about that being somewhere between 5 and 10 years in the future that we would be able to do that. The tests that we are able to do with some of that now have to be highly scripted and are website specific. So if you have, if you want to do this, it just gets cost prohibitive at a certain point, right? So you have to go in, you have to say, take this product from my website, put it in the cart, then do this, change the quantity, now go to the checkout. And, so you have to really give it specific instructions for checking out. And so it's not so easy to do that. That typically happens on more enterprise e-commerce sites that they're looking for that. And they've already checked. They already know that the accessibility is there. It's really just them testing, did I break something when I made this last change, right? So
as far as the tab function on any site, there's not really a tool that would, I guess it would probably check it, but it's not going to actually test it rather than manually tabbing through and seeing
you need
what
to
your
manually
responses are.
And there's some webinars and things that are out there, and some ways that people have tried to, put out a tutorial on how to do that. It's not, it's not super hard, but you want to kind of begin to look at those things on your site, right? And that's the piece is that a lot of people just want the easy button. They want something, one little automated solution that will do it all. And there are services and plugins out there that purport to do that. Some of them are getting sued now, and they're targeted in the lawsuits anymore because like 25, those are called overlay plugins. So they're running a little bit of JavaScript over the website, ostensibly to fix accessibility issues on the fly. They usually put a little widget down in the bottom of the site with some tools. Those are highly problematic for a lot of reasons. They conflict with tools that disabled users would already have on their machines, so that they could make the other 99% of the websites on the web work. And neither tool works then. There's some privacy concerns because they store information from session to session.
Yeah, it would have to be by a browser session, right? That would be stored.
But there's some concerns about that, but they don't work for people, but they also are not fixing only 30% of those issues because it's an automated tool, right? And so a lot of times people put these on their sites, and there was just a case announced last week or the week before that a guy that was running a dermatology clinic in New York State, and he had bought the Accessibility plugin. He got sued. He went to them because they promised some kind of support if there was litigation, and they gave him none. And so then he filed a class action suit against them. And so what we see is actually the sites that are running those sorts of overlay plugins are being targeted for lawsuits. 25% of all the ADA cases last year were people running those plugins.
With an overlay.
Because
interesting.
Those predatory or serial lawsuits, they know that those tools can only fix 30% of the issues. And so they don't even look for what those other issues are. They just
a couple of years ago, a couple of years ago when accessibility really started entering the limelight, like like a big old light shine on accessibility, really a couple of years ago from what I've seen. I didn't know anything about it. So I dove right in. The agency owner of my agency, Eric, he is completely blind in one eye. And so he has a lot of vision issues, but he actually at the time was using Accessibility. So I was like, oh, cool, check it out. So I talked to it. I had somebody from Accessibility on the podcast, great guy. And he affirmed it opened the floodgates though to the division in the accessibility world, which I was unaware or unready for. But it did. I mean, he even said it is not the end all, but it is for some people. It does. It's able to do certain things. But as you pointed out, there's a lot of other concerns that back alongside of that. So I took an even further step and then talked with somebody who was very anti pop-up. This was a couple of years ago. And so I really got to be exposed to that world a little more. All that to say, yes, I think it's very widely known now that pop-ups are kind of like a Band-Aid to an actual problem that's underlying, and there are privacy issues.
So a great resource for learning more about how those overlay plugins and scripts work and why they're problematic is overlayfactsheet.com. And so that's written, just gives you a lot of information about that. And then it's signed by including me, over 800 accessibility professionals about, really you shouldn't use these. I mean, there's a case to be made if you have a lawsuit that you've got to get it. It's like a stopgap measure until you can get everything fixed. There's a small case to be made for that. But in many cases, you're going to be way better off just really fixing the underlying accessibility issue, because the moment you stop paying those folks, all of those issues are still there, right? It's kind of
right. That's a good point. And what's interesting too is I had a couple different accessibility chats inside of my community Web Designer Pro. One was a blind entrepreneur named Hobie Wedler, who is actually a supporter of Accessibility. And what he kind of said, I don't want to paraphrase it, but it was really especially for businesses who absolutely just do not have a budget for a developer to go in and do potentially thousands of dollars worth of accessibility work. It seems like a Band-Aid option to at least show that they're trying to add a little buffer room until they can support more advanced work.
The interesting thing is the issues that those plugins fix are those low-level issues that don't require a lot of technical knowledge that we were talking about before.
Oh, okay.
Things like alt text and color contrast, and it's really not fixing the things that are super expensive at all. And so, I get it, and I'm very aware there's this kind of division, but just try to educate. Just read up on them. On them. Understand why. I mean, there are a lot of blind people who block the IP addresses for those services so that they don't have to they prevent their browsers from ever going there to avoid having to deal with them, because it represents such a stumbling block.
Gotcha.
If they have tools installed and configured on their machine to work for them everywhere else on the web, then these overlays hijack that and make neither tool work. And that's problematic.
Gotcha. Yeah. And for the record, I'm not an overlay. I'm not a supportive overlay necessarily. I'm learning about both ends of the spectrum. So it was an interesting kind of use case. And I feel like I was positioned to be a bit of a middleman who was open to hearing both sides of the argument.
Yeah, for sure.
Just wish I had blocked some of the emails that came through. I was like, good Lord, people, I'm just learning here. Give it a break. But I understand that there's a lot at stake here, and it is in the name of helping folks who have a disability or are not able to use the internet, like somebody without vision problems or a physical disability. That's the name of the game.
There's a humanitarian piece of it, but it's also about your business, right? If a person who's blind or has a mobility disability can't check out on your website, you're losing sales. Right. People who, the CDC in the U.S. estimates that about 25% of all U.S. adults have some sort of disability that requires an accommodation. So we're not talking about tiny little numbers of people here. There's a lot of people. They represent about $490 billion in disposable income. So why would you not be doing everything you can to close the places where people are leaking out because they can't navigate or complete a sale on your site?
And it really, the best analogy to keep it simple for everyone that resonated with me is it's like building a coffee shop, but not having a wheelchair ramp or not having,
Exactly.
like it's all stairs, like not everyone's going to be able to come up. So that's great, Beth. Great foundation here. Before we take a little deeper dive into e-commerce specifically, because I have a lot of questions about that, I think we need to cover what's ahead. The European Accessibility Act. Can you kind of share? This is fairly new news to me, so I'd love to hear. Tell us about it. What do we need to know?
So in the US, we have ADA. The EU has had some web or digital accessibility laws on the books. But in 2022, they passed what's called a directive. So it's some of this gets into the nitty gritty about how laws get passed in the EU. So bear with me a moment. So they passed a directive that calls for far-reaching kind of accessibility around web and what's called ICT or internet communication technology. And so all kinds of products and services, any product and service that has any kind of basically digital component to it is required to have certain level of accessibility. And not only the web, so your website, the websites have to have that. The product or service has to have be accessible. You have to have a statement, and you have to, on that website, you have to be showing regular testing by a certified professional, which is we're not even to that point yet. We're sort of dealing with the beginning phases of that. So the piece of that, so it's requiring website accessibility at the standard of WCAG, Website Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1 AA. So if that's a place where you get all the technical pieces of all the things you need to implement to make sure you're meeting those guidelines. So then each individual country after that is responsible for making their own set of laws under this umbrella directive that sets the minimum standards. And each country, as we've been watching them come out, a few of them are making their standards a little more strict. So they're wanting the WCAG 2.2 AA. Then they're also putting in their enforcement mechanisms. So there's a kind of oversight authority. There's a process by which there's a complaint that can be filed. And all of them are a little bit different. Kind of, some of them are much more laid back and very, like, those minimum will meet the minimum. Others of them are much more strict because that's just the character of these different countries and their approaches. In Germany, not only can individual consumers that are either disabled or on behalf of consumer groups can file complaints, and the oversight authority can go looking for people who are not complying, but your competitors can also file a complaint or complain that you're not being compliant. And the strategy there is they want to level the playing field. If I spent a lot of money or time and resources making my website, my services compliant, and my competitor didn't, they have an unfair advantage, and that's elite by being illegal, by avoiding the requirement. Mm-hmm. And so I can report them so that it tries to level that playing field. The fines, most of them are monetary fines. So they're somewhere around 60,000 euros per instance. A lot of them, some of them are 100,000 euros per instance. In Ireland, you can get 18 months of jail time. I mean, they're pretty serious about some of these sorts of pieces. And so the enforcement deadline is coming up in June 28, 2025. So we're about 11 months from the time of this recording anyway, to getting that going. And here's the kicker that has to happen for a lot of US companies. It's like GDPR, it's based on where your customers live, not where your business is based. So if you have EU customers, and they have an exemption if you're a small business. So if you're under 2 million euros, about $2 million in annual revenue, or under 10 employees, you're exempted for now, but there's some expectation that those levels will come down eventually. So you'll probably want to start paying attention to this, even if you're exempted now. But if you have EU customers, you're going to want to start getting that work done. It can take if you're pursuing remediation work at a moderate pace on a moderately sized website, that can take 6 to 9 months, right? Because it just takes a while to get stuff done. And so 11 months is not very long, right? To be looking at that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about my website. I have hundreds of post types between blogs, tutorials, videos, podcasts. I created my website customers? In 2017. Oh yeah. Yeah. Customers all over the world. So yeah, like I have a lot of work to do. I'm actually working on a new site. So, but the thing, I'm glad you mentioned the revenue issue, because I do wonder, like for a mom and pop pizza shop who is like barely able to pay $1,000 for a website design, for example.
Well, they're not selling product to the EU probably. Or are you thinking in Europe? In Europe?
Oh no, I was thinking more locally. Yeah. So that's a good distinction too. There's things stateside, which
you have to have, but ADA, actually restaurants and hospitality industry are the second most sued vertical. And you have to have things. And so, I look at restaurants all the time. The number one thing that restaurants do that's not accessible, that's going to get them sued sooner or later.
Can I guess?
Is
PDF menu?
PDF menus. Exactly. Just put it on the web page. Yeah. It doesn't take that much effort to put it on the web page.
They're like, how long is it going to make you or take this web designer to do it? No, we'll just throw a PDF up there. Yeah. That was, I did a couple of restaurant websites, and I was like, yeah, I think we should put it on the website. And they're like, no, we'll just send you the PDF. This was even before accessibility was talked about 10 years ago. So it's tough.
And partly the PDFs are not, it's not just people who are blind. It's people with low vision where you can't magnify things. It's people that have mobility issues because you got to like pull, you got to like pinch and scroll that thing way out, and then the mobility issues you can't scroll around in that PDF. Oh yeah, they're kind of a mess. And so restaurants, and then also this is a much smaller group in the hospitality industry, but also small hotels. So the big chain hotels have taken care of this. But it's the smaller kind of small chains or boutique or independent hotels, because they have to give information about room accessibility on their and accessible rooms. And they just often don't do that. And so that's what they get sued over.
Is there really jail time associated with certain
in Ireland?
Accessibility?
Yeah, but it's up to 18 months. But you have to pretty much either refuse to make your site accessible or lie during the investigative process.
Okay.
So I was wondering,
what would be the grounds for literal jail time for that?
Lying about your compliance efforts could be grounds for jail time, but also just refusing. And I don't think anybody from the U.S. is going to get extradited to do jail time. I just don't think that's going to happen. But they could certainly get some pretty hefty fines. Those fines will put a lot of businesses really.
Yeah, we talked about Hans. We were one reason I had him come inside of my community and do a training was because California's new SIPA law, which is actually based off of phone tracking from 30 years ago, and how that's applying to online now, and how that's phone tracking laws are now filtering through to website traffic and privacy data. So.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Fascinating, terrifying. I know, but I know. Give us some encouragement, though. I mean, again, we're talking about some of the worst case scenarios and big issues here, but at the core, it really is the reason there's probably like some hefty lawsuits is for the good of everybody being able to use a website. Yeah.
I mean, it's all about giving people. Some their human dignity. Like all of these laws are really based in human rights laws, right? It's really about helping a person be a more fully engaged participant in our digital world, right? We all do, especially post-COVID. A lot of us were online a lot before COVID, but after COVID, I think about, my mom and dad who are in their mid 80s do so much more online, all their banking, all this stuff that they never did before COVID online, right? And so much stuff happens for us online now, banking and registering to vote and, following through on issues that we're interested in, all of those things, buying things off of all kinds of online stores. All of those things are things we want people with disabilities to be able to participate in just as much as anybody else without having to depend on a family member or a friend, right? That's kind of, we want people to be independent and spend their money with us on online stores, right?
Speaking of online stores, perfect segue. I did want to make sure we hit a few differences in accessibility, or maybe extra accessibility components to e-commerce, because I imagine everything that is the basic foundation of good accessibility, with contrast, with copy, with tabbing, with hierarchy, with color management, all those things, alt text, all that stuff is going to be applied to a simple brochure site. I quote unquote simple, along with an e-commerce site. But what are the extra areas of e-commerce when it comes to accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's just applying those same standards and guidelines, but you just have more surfaces to deal with, right? You just have more to deal with. So e-commerce is the highest sued vertical, but I think it really has to do with the fact that there's just a lot more user interaction on e-commerce sites, right? People are searching and filtering for products. People are getting things into their cart. They're going to their cart. They're changing quantities. They're checking out. They're putting in lots of info. All of that really high user interaction just creates a lot of surface area for these other issues to come up. And so it's a couple things about e-commerce to know. One is that a lot of times the basic e-commerce platform that you're using, and so that same user interaction would apply to like learning management systems, right? There are just fewer of them, right? Relative to number of e-commerce sites, right? But learning management systems or membership sites or those kinds of things, right? Same kinds of interactions in a way. You'll want to, the base kind of platform or plugin that you're using for that, whether that's, WooCommerce or Shopify or LearnDash or something else, right? A membership system, Paid Memberships Pro or whatever. The base plugin or service can be fairly accessible. All of them have some issues still, and they're working on them. But when you start adding extras on top of that, whether you're adding another third-party plugin to bring a different feature, or you're having someone custom code something for you to do some special functionality, that's when you're often introducing extra accessibility issues. And so you'll want to make sure that you're going through and checking the entire kind of user journey, whether that's the customer journey buying something, or someone signing up on your website, or going through your LMS system, the courses, going through there, and you're just kind of checking primarily, all of those base things, but then especially keyboard navigation. So it's not uncommon at all to find places in e-commerce sites where the cart and checkout process has keyboard navigation issues or other kinds of issues around screen readers not reading out text. So for instance, if you have a product and it's on sale and you have a strikeout through the regular price and the sale price is visually displayed, sometimes the screen reader doesn't pick up that to read that out loud to the person who's blind.
Wouldn't that just be best practice HTML though? If it was a strikeout, would screen readers not read I guess I don't know.
It depends on how it's done, right? Right. It depends on how it's done. And so
how's the right way to do that? Sorry to interrupt. I want to make sure.
I don't want to be careful about getting too deep in the technical weeds, but if it's simply a CSS thing that may be applied on top of something, that may not get picked up by the screen reader. And there are all kinds of things. Like one of the really common things is that people will they will create buttons instead of radio buttons for choices. So there are some really well-known, very popular, for example, swatch and gift card plugins and those kind of things where you're picking a swatch and it looks like it's a radio button. It's styled like a radio button, but they're all in divs as button. And the
I
screen
see.
reader can't, a keyboard navigation user can't get to that item. They can never select a swatch or a gift card face or whatever. And so, you want to really check that your customer process through those kinds of interactions all the way through to checkout is there. Things like making sure that you've turned, there are usually options for autocomplete. So, people with disabilities will often have turned on browser settings that it says, if you recognize this is a name field, put my name in there. If you recognize this is a phone number field, put my phone number in there. That's a huge win, not just for people with disabilities, and that we could talk about that too, right? This improves your user experience for everybody. But right, that autocomplete is turned on for your checkout process too. And so, yeah, all kinds of things, but just kind of checking that people can do the search and filter through products, right? Sometimes they can't get into the results for search and filter products, or
Okay,
all kinds of
I want to put myself on the spot to do a little live. I want to just double click on that strike through thing, because I have been using that a lot. I have some like lower end products and like lessons from my courses that I've taken out as like their own little standalone, like $27 product or something. And what I've been doing is with HTML on like in WordPress on the landing page or the sales page, I will do normally like 97, but it's striked out or struck out. Is that right? And then the price will be there. The way I do it is in HTML,
it's in the content.
It's in the content. It's not CSS. It's not graphics. It is not an image. It's literally HTML, S for strike, and then _S after the strikeout.
So I think this is more an issue when you have like a product, when you do something like in WooCommerce or in Shopify, right? You have the regular price, and then you can go into the settings for the product and you can say the sale price. And then your theme, depending on how all that's set up, your theme controls how that all happens, right? So sometimes your theme has done it correctly and sometimes they haven't, right? But you want to check those things, right? And get through them. But again, personally, when we work with and we do a lot of work, as our name implies, right? We do a lot of work with accessibility and e-commerce. And what we do is we start at the end of that process. We start with cart and checkout, and then we start to work our way back. Because if somebody can't check out, fixing stuff at the beginning doesn't help. Right?
I see.
We want to start at the end of the funnel and kind of begin to work our way back, because then you can start fixing individual products if there are problems with individual products. And those can go through. And then we would typically strategically work with the client to pick their better selling products and make sure those are all fixed first, right? So you're kind of working backwards through the end of the sales funnel.
So I got the thumbs up. So I'm guessing my method of doing anything you can pure HTML wise is probably a safer way to go just in general with accessibility.
So. Yeah. I'll be the first to admit I am not the most technically I have people on my team that are far more technical at all this stuff than me. So,
and I was just thinking more as a rule of thumb, like my guess would be as much as you could do with good pure HTML is probably the safest bet, but
be sure you're using semantic HTML and use the HTML that's there, right? So a button should do something, right? A link takes you somewhere. Right? You can style a link to look like a button. That doesn't matter. This is a hard thing sometimes for people to grasp, right? It doesn't matter that a link is scheduled to look, or that is styled to look like a button. But if you put the button HTML on it, that's wrong. Right? If it takes you somewhere, right? If it's just essentially a link. So you need to think about the semantics of the HTML, right? Use unordered and ordered lists correctly. Don't just use hyphens, right? So use HTML, but use it semantically to make sure you're doing what's supposed to be, what you're supposed to convey with the HTML.
And I just Googled semantic HTML, so I'll make sure we have some resources on that for anyone who's like, what am I getting into?
It's the thing. I mean, that concept of the buttons and the links and a links, right? Well, that difference, right? So when you have a submit button on a contact form, that should be a button in HTML. Right? It's doing something, right? The sign up thing, something that pops up a modal to sign up. It's doing something, as opposed to a link that just takes you off somewhere.
And I see this often with designers who are new, or people who maybe don't have an eye for design quite yet, and they're more focused about copy and they don't really think about the design elements, where you'll see, for example, like services, they may have like web design, graphic design, and SEO. And then the titles they're designed in like a pill shape. So it looks like a button, but it's actually just a title. And that kind of thing, I think just stylistically, I recommend not doing. But even now, it makes sense that if something is misleading, that's probably technically accessibility issues.
Yes.
If it looks like a button, but it's not a button.
And that begins to get away from, I think a lot of times in accessibility for websites, we think about and look at people who come with users who come to our site who are blind, mobility impaired, or deaf with some of the videos and audio kind of issues. But we also want to think about people who may have some level of cognitive disability, some ADHD or focus pieces. And some of what you're talking about there, that kind of misleading design, would be a factor for those sorts of folks, right? It's confusing about what that's going to do. You want to, there's a great, I'm going to blank on the author's name, but my stalwart UX book was like, don't make me think, right? Don't make them think.
Was that a copy book or is that design?
Oh, it was.
Oh yeah. It's
don't make design.
Don't make me think. Common
UX
sense approach to web usability. Steve Krug.
Yeah. Steve Krug. There you go. Krug. Yeah.
Awesome. Got that linked as well. Well, we're going to have a load of links here. A lot of good resources after this one. Okay. This is great. Bet. Like, we've really got pretty advanced and pretty into the weeds on accessibility here. So some of it is e-commerce. That totally makes sense with the complexities of the entire journey, because it's not just a page, it's the usability and the user journey. Good.
Can I have a suggestion about where we talk?
Sure.
Because we were talking at the beginning before we started recording about people who are in your community, but also freelancers, small agencies, sort of have some core competencies, and then they call out to professionals of various types, specialists of various types, right? To do that. Let me just talk a little bit about when you contact or start working with an accessibility professional, there's several ways that can be structured. And I think that can be helpful for people to think about too. Traditionally, what folks have done is get an audit done. So you hire someone like our team to come in and test all the things, right? And give you this giant report at the end. Part of the problem is typically that's a snapshot in time, and it's really expensive. It can be really expensive. We typically do, when we were doing audits, we would do what was called a sampling audit. So you kind of pick strategically 10 or 20 or 30 URLs on the site, and then you're only doing that, you're going to extrapolate from there. But the problem with those reports is that sometimes we included a little bit of consulting, but not very much, an hour. And then there's not a plan for what you're going to do with it after, and how you're going to do it, and how you're going to get things retested, how you're going to know how that's all going to work. So I watch clients get frustrated with that. You can pull in a kind of accessibility team to come alongside your existing team. Whether that's an in-house team at a big, a more enterprise or larger company, or the agency, even the freelancer, you can have accessibility professionals come alongside to do the testing and consulting and retesting for you. We do a lot of that. We do, and we do that both with kind of remediation as well as new site builds, where we're consulting as somebody, like you said, you were just going to have a site redesign. You could, somebody who wanted to worry about accessibility or work on accessibility might bring in a team to do that alongside. So it's really the implementation is still happening by the freelancer or the agency or the in-house team, but there's consulting. That's a piece of that. Then you can move into kind of done for you work. So this is also can get kind of expensive, often because you're hiring the accessibility team to identify and to fix everything. And it's typically when you have a really short timeline. So sometimes out of these lawsuits, there might be a really short window. If you've had a good attorney, you've gotten maybe 24 months, but sometimes you don't get that. You get a really short window, and then you have to be compliant. And so that might be a use case, a situation where you would want to hire someone to kind of just come in and get it done. And then finally, we offer what we call accessibility maintenance plans. And so we're testing the site, but we're identifying 5, 3, or 1 issue per month, giving you that in a report, all the consulting you need around that particular issue, testing it to evaluate that it's fixed, and then giving you a report at the end of the month. And the client can use those reports as a legal defense over time, because it shows that they have a long-term regular program of testing and remediation. And that's what the courts love to see, is that you are taking this serious. So you do want to do the right thing. You're not avoiding working on this, but this particular lawsuit, they found an issue you hadn't fixed yet. Mm-hmm. So all of those pieces can go there. Anytime you have accessibility professionals working alongside your team, whether it's, for a bigger consulting project or it's our little plans, the side benefit is that your team grows in their understanding of accessibility. You will, over time, as you fix this problem. So like we've seen it time and time again, we come alongside to do some consulting for, a development or a fix project. And we say, oh no, that plugin has a lot of problems for accessibility and it's hard to remediate. It's hard to fix them. And then we look and we find a different one. And then that whole team never uses that other problematic plugin again. They know now that they should use something else in their tech stack. And so all of those kinds of ways that you learn and grow about over time, because you're right, it is a lot and it's complex, but it's, you're most agencies and freelancers that I know do pretty much a similar thing on each site. I mean, there's some variations, but you're using pretty much the same plugins all the time or the same theme families. And so once you're learning how to do those better, you can do better.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because my hopeful, motivational takeaway from all this for anyone who's feeling overwhelmed by this is just to say, what you do on one website, you could replicate. So if you build a site that is you're really killing it with accessibility and it's continuing to evolve, that could be, maybe the structure will deviate slightly, but the core elements that you have in place, that could be your template for other sites, and your tool stack will be similar to where you do have trusted plugins and you have a process for vetting out some new functionality and features.
Quite frankly, I think if I was a small agency, I would find the client who's motivated, who's got some resources to pay, get them to pay to bring in accessibility consultants for that project. Mm-hmm. We're going to learn all of that. Then we can go back to the rest of our clients and say, hey, we now know better. There's new, and I think talking about how to sell accessibility is this is a new thing that we didn't, we're learning how important this is. We can go back now. We can fix these things for you, and you can kind of develop a package of what you could do to fix those things without any extra help. So yeah.
Yep, and a big common talking point in my community recently has been grants and how many grant opportunities there are for web designers and new businesses and small businesses. So if you were to apply for a grant and say, listen, we are looking to help this client out with accessibility or our own accessibility efforts to avoid lawsuits, we're looking for grant funding to help us invest in accessibility efforts to help more people, disabled, blind, whatever, that is a good piece for getting grant funding too. If you show that.
I don't know anything about trying to get grants like that, but there are tax credits. So if you are, let's see, if the business is less than $1 million in revenue or I can't remember if it's or less than 30 employees, you can get up to 50% tax credit. And so the client that was going to up to a $10,000 spend. So the client, this is the harder part, right? The client has to spend that money up front, and then next year on their taxes, they get a credit. They don't get money back, but it reduces the amount they owe by up to $5,000, which is pretty significant chunk. Right. So if you were normally going to charge them, $10,000 to do this. You could charge them $1,500 to do that. They can still get the $5,000 tax credit, and that could cover the additional accessibility work on the project. And
Gotcha.
And go there. But the client has to be willing to finance it, I think, in some ways, right? So it's
yeah, that makes sense. Look, Bet, you've given me a lot to think about. I do want to encourage you. I got to give you something now too, a little homework, which is to check out episode 301 of the Web Design Business Podcast, because we did talk about grants on that episode with Julia Taylor from GeekPack, who is a WordPress community builder.
Yeah.
And the reason I mentioned that is what she's found out. She's someone who has literally secured hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants. It's kind of like a whole different side business she's got going. What she discovered is these states, communities, counties, Chamber of Commerce's, even countries as a whole are looking to empower businesses who are helping, especially people who are disabled and just making things more humanitarian, like have humanitarian rights, which accessibility is. So I actually think there's a huge opportunity.
Look. I hadn't heard about those, but I'm absolutely going to. Let me give a couple more resources before we go for people that want to learn more. One is there is a Facebook group for WordPress accessibility. And of course, you don't have to be in WordPress, but there's a ton of accessibility professionals there that are friendly and can answer one-off questions, and people bring their questions there all the time. It's a great place. And the other is there is on meetup.com, there is an online meetup for WordPress accessibility. They meet twice. It's only online. They meet twice a month. They have amazing speakers and topics all the time. So it's a huge library now of all these past presentations. So it's a great place to learn. If you want to learn about testing with screen readers or doing keyboard testing or all that, some great presentations there to learn more about accessibility. Is
the Facebook group WordPress Accessibility by Equalize Digital? Is that right? I just want to make sure I have the right one, because I know there's several Facebook groups.
It has a really long name. Let me look at it.
It says WordPress Accessibility Support for Building Disability-Friendly Websites.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's it.
And then the meetup, I'll have that linked as well. WordPress Accessibility Meetup. Oh, this is in person.
No.
Oh, okay. Members 2,000.
Online.
Okay, this looks right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
And
Oh,
there's people from all over the world in there.
Just based out of San Francisco. Got it.
Well, it's based out of San Francisco because originally the foundation gives the grant that gives the all the WordPress. It's a non-location, right? So the WordPress Foundation pays for meetup.com for all the meetups, and that one says San Francisco because that's where the foundation is located. And we don't really do anything in person. So
any particular resource, Bet, that we should go to? We got a lot of links, but for you guys, accessicart.com.
One more other resource, and that is WordPress Accessibility Day. I mean, again, you don't have to be in WordPress. There will be October 9 and 10 WordPress Accessibility Day, and I'll get you the link for that. Is going to be showing, and it is 24 hours of accessibility presentations from all over the world, all different levels, from super technical to just getting started, and some great talks. I serve on that organizing team, and I'm really excited by what
it'll be an accessibility extravaganza.
Yeah, and if folks want to find us, the best place to find me is accessicart.com, and you can find out more about our plans and services there. But also, if you want to reach out and talk a little more about accessibility, don't hesitate to reach out through the contact form. Happy to chat with folks.
There it is. Bet, thank you so much for your time. Learned a lot.
You're welcome.
Definitely clarified some questions I had. And overall, look, any feelings of like overwhelm just makes me realize that this can be done one step at a time, and it can be replicated. You do a lot of accessibility on one site, your tool stack, that will apply and filter down to all other projects for agencies and freelancers specifically.
Yeah.
So
no site is ever 100% accessible. So you just have to begin to think about progress over perfection. Just take small steps.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's a good point. Same thing with privacy. Same thing with security. It's like there's no 100%. So
absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Bet. This has been great.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
All right, friends, we really took a deep dive in that one. I know there's a ton of links that are covered. You can find at the show notes for this one, which is going to be at joshhall.co/345. I have all the links saved. I think we've got all of them. So again, those are all available for you. A ton of resources. It was kind of like a mini masterclass here in accessibility for e-commerce sites. Be sure to check out Bet and her team's website at accessicart.com. That will be linked in the show notes, of course, at joshhall.co/345. If you would like some ongoing help for your accessibility help for your sites, especially if you're doing e-commerce. And again, I want to thank Bet for coming on and sharing her experience in this. She's someone who knows a lot. So it was interesting to be able to pull out some of the most important things from the basics to the advanced when it comes to accessibility. I would love to hear how this one helped you out, especially if you are an e-commerce website designer. Head over to joshhall.co/345 to share a takeaway. And again, you can connect with Bet and get all of the resources that we talked about available there at the show notes for this episode. Stay subscribed, friends, or subscribed if you haven't yet, because we've got a lot of good ones coming up. So I hope you're excited. And if you haven't checked out our podcast playlists, make sure to go to joshhall.co/playlists, and you can get podcast playlists on. They're kind of like listening paths for things like pricing, getting clients, even accessibility, and some other areas that we're going to be adding moving forward. So excited to help you out on your web design journey. And I hope this one helps you. I'll see you on the next episode. Good ones to come.